to you a little bit about Dickson Cemetery. Now, does everybody know where Dickson Cemetery is located?
No.
Okay, Dickson Cemetery is here on park property, probably, what, a tenth of a mile maybe to the west of us here. If you just go down this little alley that's right here, right before you get into the parking lot, although drive very carefully, it's really full of potholes. There's a right, and then you get up onto 43rd Avenue. And on the right-hand side of that, you'll see what remains of Dickson Cemetery. Now, it was established in 1838, and it's supposedly the first non-Indian cemetery in Rock Island County. Now, of course, white people came to this area and moved into Saucanock, lived side by side with Black Hawk and his people for a few years in 1829. So where they buried their dead prior to that I don't know. But supposedly this is the first non-Indian cemetery in Rock Island County. And it was established, the land was donated by a man named William Dickson. Now, William Dickson and his family moved to this area in 1837. They came here from Pennsylvania. And he farmed, had his house and his farm right down on the corner of 12th Street and 46th Avenue. So that would really have been right at the north end of the city of Saucanock. And in 1838, he set aside 2 acres of land right up here to be used as a cemetery, and his intention was to donate it to a Presbyterian church. Now, they're not sure if it was the Presbyterian church in Rock Island or in Milan. Apparently, he was a founder of both, and the record is not really clear, but it doesn't really matter because the Presbyterian church didn't wind up taking that property anyway. Now, as I said, the original cemetery was 2 acres, and that's what it shows on the plat map. The northern boundary of that cemetery ran along what was called Rodman's Line. It was the southern boundary of land that had been purchased by Thomas Rodman of the Arsenal. If you've been out on the Arsenal, Rodman Avenue, that's that Rodman. And I was talking with Diana earlier, and we think that's probably 42nd Avenue. The western border of the cemetery was 14th Street, is 14th Street. The southern border of the cemetery is, I had seen it written in documentation as I was doing my research on this, was 43rd Avenue. However, I do know that a neighbor just on the opposite side, the south side of 43rd Avenue, a number of years ago, when he was doing some digging in his yard, came upon a gravestone. So I'm kind of wondering, maybe 43rd Avenue, that's a little whatever. And then the east end, the east boundary of the cemetery was along the old Indian Trail. Now, this land, as I said, was donated, and the land up here owned by William Dickson up until maybe at least 40 or 50 years ago. You could still see old Indian corn hills in that cemetery, and there's a photograph excuse me, of John Hawberg standing among the corn hills in the cemetery just to the west of us here, which for me as a researcher is interesting. I know, of course, that Indians farmed along the bluff that is 12th Street, but this indicates that they were farming up on top of the bluff as well. So that's just kind of something that helps me understand the Indians a little bit more. Between 1838 and 1866, there were at least 34 burials, marked burials in that cemetery. And among those are Rina and Nancy Wells, 2 of the earliest white folks to come into Saucanock in 1899. Their son, there are several Vandriffs that were buried there as well. And then in 1866, that land changed hands. David B. Sears, who was one of the earliest settlers in Moline, purchased a portion of William Dickson's land. And part of what he purchased was what they called the south half of the old cemetery. Now, excuse me, there were several burials after that, and then in 1878, David Sears, who was the son of David B. Sears, sold the north half of the cemetery to his stepmother, Margaret J. Sears. She was the fourth wife of D.B. Sears. D.B. had gone off, he'd been doing some dams and things like that out in Kansas and came back with a wife. When they returned, that's when they built the house that's up on the hill that Scott Roman, that the site manager, lives in now. So that's the old Sears house. So on October 1st, 1878, by quitclaim deed, the north half of the cemetery was transferred to Margaret Sears, and then that very day, Margaret and D.B. Sears, her husband, transferred the entire cemetery plot, the whole 2 acres, to Rock Island County. So it went from being private property to being the property of the county. The county then built a fence around the cemetery. The south half remained what they called the old cemetery, and there continued to be burials right up until 1918. The last burial there was in 1918, that were marked. The north half of the cemetery, however, was turned into a pauper's cemetery, or a potter's field, as they were also known. And so from 1878 until the time when the county closed the cemetery, or in 1911, excuse me, when the county closed the cemetery, the north half of that cemetery, which I'm assuming, well, all the way up to 42nd Street there, 42nd Avenue, was a potter's field. And from what you read in the records, they would just put the coffins in, and it started getting crowded, so they were putting coffins in on top of coffins, and then after a while the coffins started popping up out of the ground, and neighbors began to complain, and the cemetery really began to fall into disrepair. And so in 1911, the county closed the cemetery. Now the reason I say that the last burial was done in 1918 is that in 1918, May of 1918, John Hauberg and David Sears, son of D.B., took a walk through what was left of the old cemetery there. And David Sears shared with Mr. Hauberg his knowledge, what he knew about the folks that were buried there. There's nice long paragraphs on some, I don't know her, but there was a new made grave. So I'm saying, okay, new made grave, probably 1918, 1917, and this was the wife of Mr. Ailes, who was also buried there. At any rate, the county closed the cemetery down, and then in 1918 deeded the cemetery to the city. So now the city of Rock Island had it. Again, the cemetery just continued to deteriorate. It was uncared for. It was an eyesore, and so a movement began to rise, headed by John Hauberg, to have the cemetery, or what was left of it at any rate, the southern portion of it, the old cemetery, taken over by the state of Illinois. And in 1942, the state of Illinois purchased the last 5 acres of what is now our entire 208 acres here at the park. And that included Dickson Cemetery, the land that's right behind the parking lot here, the Singing Bird parking lot, and down. And so my thought is that what we know as Dickson Cemetery today, what is preserved there, what we mow, what we maintain, is just the southwest corner of the original cemetery. And so that there are probably burials that come well into the woods there, and probably northward as well. And I know, I'm not sure when the house on the corner of 42nd Avenue and 14th Street was built, but I think that was part of the cemetery at one time. So if that's your house and there's ever anything funny going on, you might know there's some poltergeists there. The state of Illinois took it over, and again, state being what they were, did a little bit to try to clean things up, but it still remained in a pretty serious state of disrepair. The headstones fallen over, covered with dirt, covered with leaves. And then in 1976, a young Eagle Scout decided that he wanted to do a project in the cemetery. Now, unfortunately, prior to that time, people had come into the cemetery and had stolen a a number of the gravestones. And there was a rumor, we were just talking about it at dinner, that someone, I don't know if it was in Rock Island or in Davenport or what, had actually made a patio out of these gravestones. According to comments by Mrs. Cleveland, who was a neighbor to the area, she actually witnessed someone loading gravestones up into the back of their pickup truck. She wrote the license number down and the stones were returned, but when they were returned to us, they were just, we'll just dump them. And there they were, all lying and broken. When I first came here in 1981, there were still several stones out there, as well as a number of wooden crosses that had been erected by this Eagle Scout to at least show where these people, the names that we had, where they were buried. Those have since fallen into disrepair too. Now, someone asked me, do we still have those gravestones, the ones that were stolen? And yes, we do. They are in the old maintenance shop right there, but they're broken, they're in pieces. But this is where I've gotten my database that I have of who is buried out there. There's also a database that is available online. And the one that it's on geocities.com, I believe, is incomplete. So that list had some names I didn't have. I have some names they didn't have. And then, of course, I got information from John Hobart, too. Now, a couple of years ago, because it kind of bothers me that there's this historic cemetery. It's really kind of interesting. It goes back to the earliest part of the history of Rock Island County. It bothered me that there are people that whose remains are out there, and the stones. I mean, we've got them. What am I supposed to do with them? Just take them and stick them in the ground? Well, that's close enough. They're out here someplace. But nah, I really can't do that. And so I'd come up with an idea and found an Eagle Scout who was interested in taking on this project of putting together a pamphlet that would detail the history of Dickson Cemetery, and then putting up just perhaps a large board with names routed in it, with the names of everyone that we know who is buried out there, so that at least there's some memorial to them, at least there's some acknowledgement that they're buried out there. And he was real gung-ho about it. I tried to sell it to some other Eagle Scouts, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to build bridges. But this young man was really interested. This young man was really interested in history, and we had had several conversations, and we're beginning to pull the project together. And then Rod Blagojevich struck and decided, yes, made the announcement that he was going to shut the museum down, which of course he did eventually have done, and the boys' parents pulled the project. They said they didn't want their son doing an Eagle Scout project at a park that was going to be closed down. So here I am now, 2.5 years later. I still have the idea, and I'm still just looking for that Eagle Scout as a way to kind of pass on the history of the cemetery and memorialize the people that were there. So I just, are there any questions?
Is there a name list?
I beg pardon?
A name list.
Well, what I have, okay, this is a database. This is a database that I did based on, I actually sorted it in 3 different ways, based on names and the dates that they died and who they're related to. And as I said, this list is not complete because as I checked out that list online, they had people listed that were not on my list. So between those 2 lists of what I can document from Hauberg's interview and from the stones that we have on hand, also from this map, from the map that had been hand-drawn out. Oh, there it is. Right here. Okay, and then I combined it with the list that's online, and so there are 66 known burials. 66 names.
Are the Sears on there?
No, no.
No Sears?